Duncan-Fernandez with Somos and Escrito, along here with fellow editor Jenny Irizary. We're here today to interview David Romero on his book, My Name is Romero. So thanks, David, for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's always great to chat with you. And Jenny's here as well. Hello, Jenny.
Hello.
So Jenny, why don't you kick things off? We can start peppering him with questions.
Sure. Okay. Well, this is a pretty general one. Do you have any poetry that you choose to only perform, but not not present in a written form, or vice versa?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. So while writing, My Name is Romero took about a decade to put together. And in that time, I was writing not only things for the book. So, I would love to say that I had the discipline over this time to only compile things, only compile works that fit along this theme, exploring, family, culture, identity. But at the same time, I was also writing about my hometown, people who lived there who might have passed away or I lost contact with, or, ex-girlfriends that I pined for, the ones that have got away, and things of this nature that didn't, fit along with some of these themes. Yeah, actually, there are a number of poems that I wrote during this time that didn't even make it into. So a lot of that material that I was referring to ended up now is in a new collection called Diamond Bars 2, which is a sequel to my first self-published book of poetry, Diamond Bars, the street version. And so Diamond Bars 2 has a lot of that material, but even then, I've gotten rid of a lot of the poems that are just, I want this to have some gravitas. Those poems are just too silly. There's a poem that I wrote about marrying macaroni and cheese. So that was one example, inspired by a conversation I had with my nieces, and I was looking at the front end of this book of poetry that I was putting together, and I was like, this is about alcoholism and like mistakes that I've made, and like this terrible feeling of dread of like being unemployed for many years and being a poet and struggling and not making it. And a poem about marrying macaroni and cheese might like take people off that journey. So maybe I should get rid of that one.
So David, maybe interject here. So you were from Diamond Bar, right? California?
Yeah, I'm from Diamond Bar, California. So
yeah, maybe you could tell us. I should have started out with your bio. I apologize for that. Maybe you can tell us a bit about yourself in this, as we're already in.
So I am. All right. So both of my parents are Chicana. They are from Boyle Heights and East Los Angeles, respectively. My father and mother. And competing rival neighborhoods, from the east side with long histories. And of course, they actually like to tell me how diverse the neighborhood was, and saying that, this idea of these neighborhoods as only, Chicano, only Latinx, being a, relatively new phenomenon, that there were, all kinds of different peoples there at the time, Jewish and Polish and Japanese and African American and Caucasian, different types of Caucasian people. And so anyways, they moved to a community which was at the time at the edge of nothing, that is now pushing further and further east here in California, the sprawl of Los Angeles, which I don't know if anyone, if you've ever flown into Los Angeles or driven, from downtown and out to its radius, it's a never-ending metropolis, which is very different from other cities. I just visited Paris, and it pretty much goes from a giant city and a few satellite cities to farmland, to absolutely nothing. So yeah, it's a relatively strange phenomenon that we have here in Los Angeles, and Diamond Bar is very much a part of that. It's an upper middle class, suburban community that is majority Asian and then Caucasian, and then yes, minority populations being Latinx, mostly Chicanos, and then African American and other various groups within that.
So did you grow? So you grew up there. Was it were you like the one of very few Chicanos in your schools?
Yes, very much. So yeah, that was very much a thing growing up. Of you know, a lot of my work is about identity and identity confusion, specifically. So being a pochismo, and it's about, you know, finding one's place in a world in which Diamond Bar very much was a world in which there wasn't a lot to tie in. Like there weren't murals, there weren't museums, there weren't community spaces, art galleries, you know, anything like that to really, any places to go. The only place that you would go and feel Mexican was a Mexican restaurant, you know, and even those, you know, were criticized by many people as not being authentic enough, you know. So it was an interesting experience with that. And that there were just a handful of people with Spanish surnames. And then, you know, a lot of those people were Filipinos, Filipinx people, you know. So like there were shared understandings, but also like a gap, you know, between us in that. And then, yeah, it was one last thing to say about it. It was very interesting too, that I love explaining to people about growing up in this neighborhood is like, you were given a choice of like fitting in with a certain group of being, then you would be Latino, you'd be a real Mexican, right? And you'd be expected to dress a certain way, talk a certain way, act a certain way. And if you didn't conform to that, which was very limited, you know, a lot of the times it was either very reflective of hip hop culture or very reflective of like a kind of like greasers versus socias outsiders kind of culture that existed for a brief time. I forget what they called themselves. They had a name for themselves, but that was like the Latino culture for a time, that you were given a choice, or you were white. You were cast out as being white or other. You know, if you listen to rock music, or, you know, even like there was really no place for Chicanismo in suburbia. No one really knew what that was.
I mean, this brings up a good point. I mean, I like had a great connection with your book and like a reader response in a way, right? Because I mean, I've lived a lot of these same things, right? But like I know, like in your titular poem, you talk about where's that little quote I put there? Oh yeah, and I know some of you are thinking on just another white guy trying to prove he's Latino, or another Mexican chest beating his chest, beating whatever reputation he has left, trying to convince you that his family, his country, his nationality are better than you. And what really strikes me about that is this, like, even after 500 years of colonization, you know, like we like looking, you know, like people like with the pull between the, you know, how your name and how you look and what your culture is, how it interrelates, is still taken as like you have to be, like you're saying, you have to be within this very set limit ways. I know exactly what you mean too, because if you weren't a certain way, like you're trying to be, you get accused of trying to be white, or you get accused trying to be something, you know, or I mean, you can talk about, I mean, like what do you think, like even like our identity, Chicano identity is under attack like constantly by, if you don't fit this mold, like you have to, like I see that poem, you have to proclaim who you are, and you have another one, Our Name Is Romero. To me, that one was more about like not reclaiming, but also doing what I think a lot of Chicano work does. Like you got to have, like we don't have our history, right? So now we got to put history. You got to be our scholar. You got to be our like storyteller. You got to be our poet. You got to be our political advisor. You got to be everything. Maybe you can talk. I mean, you know. I think you know what I'm talking about. Maybe you can talk about this notion of like putting everything in there and proving and taking back who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, yes. So it's in some ways reflecting back, it's almost quaint. But before those ancestry.com DNA results came in, which I literally did, not just a joke in the poem, but I legitimately did have a fear that somehow my parents had been keeping something from me that I wasn't, because I had been told that my whole life, from my brother, true story. And even though, I had a sister who had the same complexion that I did, it's still, well, sometimes you would tell me, it said, she was adopted too. So it was an elaborate, multi-generational conspiracy. But which, for people who, live that experience, I mean, I think that's its own concern, but it is definitely a concern for a lot of us, who look different from our siblings, look different from our parents, who can pass, or who, especially those of us who are pochos, that we don't fit in many times with our friends, our families, or relatives. Um, we're constantly questioned. Our legitimacy is constantly questioned, especially if we enter into conversations where, we're trying to fight for something. We're trying to fight against injustice, or fight against people's prejudices, or whatever it might be. The kickback, the response very often from people is, what grounds do you have to say that on? You're not even one of us. You're not really, one of us. It's to question our identity. It's to exclude us. So a lot of that, yeah, it does actually come from that. Is there in one drive, there's so one of the themes of My Name Is Romero is like loss and death. And so that definitely, a lot of the ties to genealogy do come from that. But yes, it also is this other thing of like, yes, for some people, I in order to prove to them, and it gave me a stronger sense of self that I now have, that I now carry with me, is carrying that history, is really knowing of my root, that my roots do go back multi-generational, in a multi-generational way. And also, as far as, like political points such as the Mexican American War, and a lot of the things that, surround that, this whole issue of we didn't cross the borders crossed us, is that having a record of my own family's history within that time, how it went a long way towards, forming a more personal connection with these issues.
I mean, just on a side note, do you find anyone involved in the Talons Revolt?
In a what?
The Talons Revolt.
Oh, the Talons Revolt. No, but we did often visit that site. Yeah, so it was very interesting in one way, being grown or raised in the super Catholic, household, and being taught that's the way to be, and all of these kinds of things. But then also like, hey, here's where the Native Americans, revolted, and so yeah, I always thought that was really fascinating. I would love if one day someone discovered that some of my ancestors were involved in that.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was like Pope's Rebellion, but also the Talons Revolt is when the U.S. came over and all the Indians and like New Mexicans like rose up and like went after all the Americans.
Oh, nice. Yeah. See, okay, yeah,
I could go on that, but like I was going to ask you, so one of your poems, what was it? Make Me More Mexican, right? You talk about kind of like what you're saying, but also like, learn Spanish and things like this. And it kind of struck me. So if so many people like speak Spanglish or bad Spanglish or speak Chicano English or Calo, I mean, to me, that's kind of a Chicano, like we've been rolled over, like you said, my family too, right? They crossed us, and they made all the laws and everything in English, and they, force it, certain paths, you got to speak English, right? And so it's just, to me, that's kind of the Chicano condition, having, being bad at Spanish. So, like, actually, I know a little bit, right? But you see people from like Spanish speaking countries, they're good at Spanish.
Yeah, yeah.
Even better than Grandpa. You know?
What? Yeah.
So, I
Yeah,
mean, what
well,
are your thoughts? I mean, like, because it's like there's not that much like Spanish education, despite their and like one thing that kind of got me, like I remember being sixth grade, that they were teaching us tourist Spanish.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh,
like how to talk to your maid, how to talk to the guy in Cancun getting you a drink. Yeah,
right,
and so I was
right.
a little bit like upset about that, but you know, what can you do when you're like, you know, 11 years old, whatever. But I mean, like to me, this is, I mean, what do you think, far as like the language and things like this? Like, you know, like it's another thing that pull at authenticity, you know, like the
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think yes, the more yeah, so if you're multi-generational Chicano, Chicanx, Latinx person, the more likely it is that you don't speak Spanish. And there's a real reason for that, as you've been alluding to, is that there was a lot of persecution following the Mexican-American War. So in Texas, you have record numbers of lynchings, the highest percent of lynching per any population in American history was of Mexican Americans, of Chicanos, at that time, higher than at any point than it was at the South or in the South of African Americans. So, of course, over a longer period of time, African Americans, you know, have faced the greatest amount of repression and persecution in American history, and over a much longer time. But in this short window, for about 20 years, it was a horrible. Hundreds of Mexicans were lynched in Texas. And this is, you know, in Los Angeles, you had, I believe it was called the Greaser Act, or as you can see a piece of documentation saying that with any suspicion of greasers, so Mexicans carrying firearms, with any suspicion that they could be detained, deported, questioned, you know, basically anything could happen. So one signifier of that, of course, that would call people's attention to you would be speaking Spanish. So, and even the way that people are schooled, they're schooled, you know, never to speak Spanish whatsoever. So there were, in various counties, various states, there were laws that were official and laws that were unofficial, that restricted or put a focus away from speaking Spanish. So there's a great amount of repression, and there's a whole history tied in, and a lot of times that people knew, even if it necessarily wasn't illegal, that it still would lead to other problems, that it would, you know, that it would feed into people's prejudices and could lead to other problems. So there's a real history of that amongst people, multi-generational, in Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California. You know, the American Southwest, the areas that were formerly Mexico. This is where the greatest amount of repression exists. Now you'd see other areas like New York, New Jersey, Florida. You know, they have their own unique histories. But something that really put this into clarity for me was reading this book, Latinos Inc. by Arlene Davila. And she talked about the difference in consciousness that more recent immigrants had from multi-generational Chicanos. And she said that multi-generational Chicanos were much more likely to feel insecure about their use of Spanish, or to not speak Spanish, feel more insecure about their identity as, you know, Latino Americans, Latinx Americans, and that because the more recent immigrant populations very often, and not just impoverished people, but middle class and upper class people from these different countries would have a completely different conception of Latinidad and self, not just as an oppressed people who were constantly underfoot, but as, you know, people who belonged wherever it was that they went, you know, people who were, you know, working professionals, people who were business people who were, you know, and carrying their own classist, you know, kind of attitude. So what we have now is this fascinating mix of all of these different ideologies and conceptions of what it is to be Latinx.
Yeah, I'm kind of like on the language front. I remember being in college, like everyone like turned on me while we discussed Ebonics. You know, I'm a bit older. We called it Ebonics then. And they all looked at me and said, when they come to this country, they need to speak English. I'm like, Black people, right? And then like I told them, I said, my great aunt doesn't speak English. And they're like, well, you don't need it in Mexico, do you? And I'm like, well, she lives in New Mexico. And she's like, 80 years old, and then she said, didn't leave the ranch that much, and it's just like, but like, she's New Mexican in like, so a lot of, my grandfather, he spoke English, but, he spoke Spanish probably a little better, right? So it's just amazing how people don't even know, like a lot of times, like Americans don't even know their own history, but they came to us, and they want to oppress us no matter what. I had other comment here. The other thing I like to say. So I really love your ode to the burrito, and it really makes me think, because I told this to someone the other day, like the Mexican restaurant is older than the United States. They've been here longer than the United States, right? They, like whatever. But yeah, it's true. You could go to and then there's been taqueria, wasn't Tiburcio Vasquez? His mom had a taqueria, a little Mexican restaurant. And that's where he got the first fight that made him made him outlaw, because somebody was hassling his sister, and he had words with the gringo about it and punched him out, and law came after him. So I mean, our food is culture and all these things like that. I mean, I really love. I mean, I love burritos. I think Jenny could jump in here because I know she loves burritos, and we talk about burritos all the time. Oh, I had one. Go ahead, Jenny. Then I have one to ask you.
Oh, I would say go ahead, because I was actually going to ask a little bit more about how you write about like the situation in like the Southwest and North America, but also other situations where the U.S. has staged coups or undermined like native sovereignty and things like that. But Scott, what were you going to say?
Really? You want me to ask my question about a burrito after that? Okay, how do I thread this needle between burritos and
okay, I'll go ahead, because you must have noticed, you go to a taqueria, a burrito is like $10-12, right? Now taco is like $2 or $3. So you think they're like I mean, I like burritos, but I think they're overcharging a burrito, because like most Anglos are getting a burrito, and like most Mexicans are getting a taco. That's what I always thought,
All right, so burritos are a hot point of debate, no doubt.
Yeah.
So there's much arguing about where the burrito exactly was invented, and there is much scholarship about this.
Oh yeah.
But I can't quote any specific authors, unfortunately. But I do know so there are some people that say Southern California. There are some people that say Northern Mexico, right? So they're saying that the burrito was most likely invented following the Mexican-American War, and that's why there is this issue as to argue whether or not it is genuinely Mexican, invented by Mexican nationals. So that is a hot point of debate. And a lot is invested in this, especially because you reference tacos. Tacos are much more common, widespread throughout the majority of Mexico. So there very much is. So burritos have really taken off in the United States and have their own, culture, and now have been culturally appropriated by multinational conglomerates such as Taco Bell and Chipotle, and sold and chewed out and regurgitated out for mass American consumption. So this does become very important, and now you're seeing kind of like you call it the hipster focus on tacos as like this need to reorient the cool, to find to replug into the authentic. So it's kind of like, in telling the story of the burrito, I think it's kind of interesting because what I'm tying into is whole notion of like what's authentic, what's fake, and what's not, is that no, for people, for a lot of us, Northern Mexican culture is authentic.
Yeah.
Southern Californian culture shaped by Chicanos is authentic. So whatever the true reality might be, but it's also a point of like, I think there are a lot of stories in the legend of the invention of the burrito. The burrito, I think, is very similar to the hamburger, is that I believe it was a food that was made for travelers.
Yeah.
So I think the whole point of the burrito was that it was not necessarily to be eaten in one sitting. The idea is that you make this large thing and maybe you eat a few bites of it at a time and, continue writing on, about your business. I think that's, yeah.
I had read that it was from Northern Mexico, and they made it to put in their saddle to go right out and deal with the cows and come back, which could be, but I mean, the other thing, like it really brings to mind, like SoCal and like New Mexico, right? It's like Southern California is not just like monoculture. Like Mexicans from all over like have gone to like that area, right? That's why there's not like what they call like California cuisine, right? I mean, like there is, but it's like, really not that much different from anything else. But yeah, it's like a lot of different people come in. Like anyway, we can go on about the taco and the burrito, but
yeah,
like, that's a minefield. I don't want to get anyone upset at me.
Yeah. We could. This is a hole to dive in. Yeah.
Yeah, I love tacos and burritos both. They're great at Jack in the Box.
I think there should just be more appreciation all around, and appreciation for our family in the South. With their own unique foods and whatnot.
Jenny, what was your question again on
in Oaxaca?
On conspiracies, or what was it?
No, it had to do with other national questions of borders and imperialism.
Yeah, and I noticed that you had a really like you had a couple of poems that were about sort of other like examples of like what the US did in Hawaii and things like that. And I noticed that you had a sort of on the topic going back to grief and loss. You even mentioned like a few instances of like sort of losing someone or losing multiple people where it served as an impetus to like finish the book, and also just an impetus in general to work on certain like projects and topics and stuff in your writing.
Oh, wow. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So yeah, specifically, I think the poems that would reference a lot of questions explicitly of national borders and imperialism, and kind of drawing parallels between the situation with the United States and Mexico and the situations in other nations would be letters across borders. Could we eat our way to world peace, which examines these in more of a humorous, kind of ridiculous way, and in some ways satirizing some of the ways that people will frame these questions or look for resolutions to these questions. And also then, yes, so there are multiple ways of, and of course, open letter to Donald Trump is a way where, I list off a lot of examples of kind of in talking about crime and transgressions that, what greater crime could there be than colonialism, than imperialism, than could be the outright theft of an entire nation, its resources, its sovereignty, its ability to self-determination, its people, and abducting them and forcing them into slavery or other forms of compulsory labor. It's the theft of its resources, of its land, so talking about, oh my gosh, wow, there's so many examples. It's kind of a flood of mind of, wow, sometimes I don't get used to, I kind of lose track of talking about these things. But of course, in speaking to those issues, the Open Veins of Latin America is definitely a great resource. Confessions of an Economic Hitman is somewhat of a sensationalist resource, but one that I definitely, go back to a lot. The Sword and the Dollar is another great book that really calls to mind a lot of these questions of imperialism, especially in Latin America. And really, I owe a lot of my understanding of those issues, one, to my great friend, the poet Matt Cedillo, and also to, before that, to my professor at USC, now is the chair of, I believe, the Ethnic Studies Department, although don't quote me on that specifically, but he is the chair of a department at UC San Diego, Curtis Marez, who was fortunate enough, or I was fortunate enough, rather, I was fortunate enough to have him write one of the quotes for the book. So that's truly been an honor to have someone who shaped so much of my thinking to then, to review it, to analyze it on a professional basis is really incredible. And speaking about that is, the way that I wanted to tell some of the stories in the section of Flowers. So Flowers is a section in this book with poems about, Jenny had mentioned about, there's one about Hawaii, there's one about independently ruled Mormon Utah. So we're talking about a time in which, the United States, as we know it, as the continental United States, had not yet been formed. There were still various undeclared lands, native lands, Mormon ruled lands, and these kinds of things. And another poem in the book, oh yes, having to do with the history of Northern Africa and Spain. So examining colonialism through a variety of lenses and exploring the ideas of PTSD, of indoctrination, through a variety of lenses, because sometimes when we talk about these issues, I've noticed that there is an immediate kickback, and people don't necessarily understand that all of these things, that imperialism, colonialism, they have these long lasting effects. And sometimes in all of those poems, there's a profound sense of loss and of grief, but also there's a certain confusion and haze about what's going on. There's a certain amount of mystery. And I think that reflects that sometimes we're not always clear on these issues. It's not always easy to identify the villains or to separate ourselves from our families, our friends, our ties, with all of these things. So those poems, hopefully kind of reflect that fog of memory, as sometimes, scholars refer to it. I think that, it's a really great question.
I have a question. So you have a kind of a stretch of poems, kind of about like celebrities and pop culture figures getting ahead on hate, like using hate to either like get position or keep it. It's like Open Letter to Cat Williams, Watch the Throne, Open Letter to Donald Trump, Open Letter to Edward James Olmos. This is like, it seems like a kind of like you really making these poems make it apparent that like people seem to get to a place, and if they want to do something else or they want to stay there, are they corrupted by the system, or they just see an opportunity they just need to go after us or their own group, or like another group that's like not in a power structure, high in the power structure, to stay where they are?
Well, I think that's a question. That's an interesting question. It's kind of like the chicken or the egg of racism. And I would kind of say that in a certain amount of circumstances, it has to do with people. They already have it within themselves. We grow up. We are brought into a very racist society, and the racism, it teaches us to be racist not only towards ourselves, as we've been talking about a great deal here, but also towards others. Really, we grow up having these really racist opinions about other cultures besides our own, And that's either because we've been indoctrinated to think that we have a stake in white supremacy, or we're part of its future and Western civilization, quote unquote, or because yes, we're actively trying to join with that for our material benefit. So I think there is a certain point in which we do become cognizant of these factors of, well, what are these different ideological groups? Which one should I join? What should I say at what moment? What's hitting right now? And these kinds of things, these kinds of concerns. And so I think in any of these cases, these open letters that you're referring to, this section, what I find interesting, okay, so the first one that was written in chronological order was Open Letter to Cat Williams. Now, there's another poem in this collection, Black and Brown Fight Tonight, that speaks to the division and the animosity between Black and Brown communities that historically you could say that we have been the most oppressed. And very often we've been pushed into some of the same communities or in very close proximity to one another. And so there's a lot of antagonism there. There's a lot of anti-Blackness that runs through our Latinx communities as a result of that. And there's also a large amount of anti-Latinidad. And a lot of people don't necessarily like talking about that. It's kind of a taboo subject of talking about the prejudice that Black communities can have towards other people of color. It's not often talked about, but I think it is a reality, and I think it doesn't really serve us to talk about that. Or it doesn't serve us to hide that, to sweep that under the rug, especially when you have this figure of Cat Williams, outwardly siding with white supremacy. In Arizona, as many people know, at the height of this is the place where, the most racially restrictive laws at that point in the nation's history, or since the time of the Mexican-American War, had been affected. That made racial profile, SB 1070, the burst out of groups like the Minutemen, and all of their various splinter groups. So this is a time where saying outright racist things was entering before the Trump era. This was kind of like the cradle or the beginnings of the Trump era, the signifiers of the Trump era that made the Trump era even possible. One could say that, yes, he doesn't make his campaign speech, crying to build the wall and saying that Latinx people are criminals, drug dealers, and rapists without this whole history in Arizona even taking place. And Cat Williams, as an African-American comedian, decides to ally himself, with this, to the point where he's saying all of these very racist things on stage. And there's a reason for that. It plays upon these generations of animosity between our two communities. And so it's interesting with the reception of this, I started performing this poem, and then people said it was anti-Black. So I'm not speaking about all Black people. I'm attacking Cat Williams. I'm attacking anti-Latinidad. I believe that Black people are amazing. There's a beautiful history. There's a beautiful, culture and all of these things that I even praise, in talking about the history of music and the co-option of that in the poem "Watch the Throne" in this collection. So I wanted to make it very clear that I harbor no hatred for Black people. What I hate is racism. What I hate is anti-Latinidad, which is present with Cat Williams. So, I criticize him. Then people say, well, why don't you criticize one of your own? So then I did that. And they say, okay, well, why don't you attack the real enemy? So I did that, People, in short, people are never satisfied.
Yeah. I mean, I recall some of the things Cat Williams said. It's just like, what was it? Like, if you Mexicans love California so much, how come you didn't fight for it? I'm like, well, it's like we did. And it's also, they had a lot of guns, a lot of cannons, and a lot of soldiers. We just had some ranch hands,
Yeah.
But,
there weren't a lot of bases. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Jenny has one last question, and then maybe we'll ask you to perform something. I know we're kind of tight on time.
Well, I think what you said kind of segues into this a little bit in terms of, well, kind of reclaiming like pochix and terms like that, or pocho, pocha, as positive rather than as an insult in this wider context that you've just been discussing.
That's a phenomenal question as well. So yeah, my inspiration for this comes from two different sources. One being Lalo Alcaraz is probably most famous for the humorist, satirist. I believe he was nominated for a Pulitzer. I'm not sure if he won. He'll win soon if he hasn't. But anyways, so he really popularized this term, pocho, which whitewashed. And I even changed it to pochex. Sometimes we're not used to our negative terms being gender neutral as well. But I find that interesting. But also and turning it into a source of pride. So there's pocho.com and kind of embracing, if we're constantly as Chicanos, Chicanx people here, and other Latinx people that have become more, that identify more with mainstream culture or not sure who they are, I believe they could embrace the term as well. It's just kind of being, proud of ourselves, or no, hey, we have this, but we own it. We know it, we own it, we love it, And another inspiration for that really for me was, also the roots of Chicano itself. Now when we think of Chicano, we think of someone, their fist in the air. We think of UFW flags, marches, rallies, protests. We think of I Am Joaquin. And even at the time, this was being written out of a desire to validate, our communities, to validate ourselves, and to have a sense of a pride in ourselves as multi-generational Latinx people, specifically Mexican Americans in the United States. And so, it's fact that every few generations we have to do it again. So whether it be Chicano, whether it be Pocho, it makes sense. And then lastly, along with that, who helped me with this was Saul Williams, African American slam poet, one of my greatest heroes as far as writing and the performance of poetry is concerned, and really thinkers, and he wrote about the use of the N-word and the different uses of the N-word, and really, reflecting about how hip hop, culturally embraced this word in order to take the poison out of it, to redefine it, to have it as a positive signifier for an entire generation. And I think that's, whether Lalo Alcaraz, conscientiously picked up, made that, hip hop, whether or not he made that connection, I think somewhere, maybe on a subconscious level, he was also working something on a similar, but also I'm sure, inspired by the Chicanos of the past. And I think that's valuable work. And anytime anyone says, hey, you should be ashamed, that is, no, I will embrace it,
Yeah, I mean, I might say, like, who could reside in the U.S. and not be a pocho, right? I mean, or even in Mexico these days, because as we the U.S. like U.S. culture is like getting around Mexican culture, and like the vice versa has happened a bit. We're coming together a little bit.
Well, I'm really fascinated. So I've spent very little time in Latin America. I've only been to Mexico and mostly border states. I spent a limited time in Guatemala. So I really look forward to, hopefully, in the next few years, spending a lot more time and learning much more about Latinx culture in the nations themselves. I think will be, very, very informative, and just seeing, the different ways. I mean, one of my favorite things to watch recently has been Rompen Todo, the history of rock in Espanol. And I find that to be really interesting because it talks, it starts at the 50s with, rock and roll and some of the first Chicano bands, and then you have cover bands in Mexico, and then soon enough there are rock movements in Argentina, in Colombia, all throughout Latin America, and with their own unique styles and embracing punk and metal and bringing back folk, and so I think it's really fascinating to think about music and culture and globalization and what's white and what's legit, what actually comes from our indigenous cultures, so it's great stuff.
I'm a big fan of Moenia.
Of who?
Moenia.
Who's
like
that?
kind of a synth pop band from Mexico. They actually like do a lot of covers from Spanish kind of synth pop and rock in the 80s. And so it's kind of like they go all around Latin America, basically in Spain even, in these songs, and you can find out like about other bands like what's it, Alaska, Rata Blanca. I don't think they do cover Rata Blanca. That's a metal band, but
nice,
things like that.
Nice. I tell you, yeah, it's great. Yeah, to play into this, I have an anecdote. So I was in Italy. Matt Cedillo and I were in a car in Italy with the famed poet of Ravenna, Paolo Gambi, who's an Italian TV star there. Social media poet, doesn't believe in publishing books, writing anything down. So we're in this car with him. He's driving, and he puts on a Mexican like synth band or DJ or something like that, and he's raving. He's like, "Yeah, I'm Mexican. can't you feel it in the beat? And
you're like, who the hell are these people? Yeah, what's this band, right?
Yeah, well, it turns out Matt Cedillo looked him up. Dude's from West Covina. So
wow.
He's Mexican, but he's about as Mexican as we are.
Yeah. That's great. So I think we're close to getting time. You have time to read a poem for us? Dealer's choice.
Hola, ¿cómo está? Me llamo David. Yo no hablo español. Un poquito. I will grow as paranoid as any gringo or gabacho over Spanish spoken. The Spanish I can't understand. Escúchela y comprende. Es la palabra verdad. This poet spits in Spanish to cover up the fact that he doesn't have anything interesting to say in any language. Es la palabra verdad. Es la lengua del pueblo. Es la lengua de la mexica. Hold your tongue. Do not think to criticize me for speaking English when you too so proudly speak the language of your European rapists, murderers, and conquerors, Spanish. Now tell me who's brainwashed, whitewashed. No hablo español. Fuck off. Come back to me when your tongue can hold words in the ancient language of the Mexica Nahua. Oh shit, this poet does spit in Nahua. Now what? Keeping it realer than real, more authentic than authentic, looks like we're at a Mexican standoff. Well, there may be 50 ways of saying snow in Inuit, but all of them describe the same substance, meaning there are truths that can be described in any language. Make me more Mexican. A simple statement, a declaration, a cry for help. I heard they were performing the procedure somewhere in a dilapidated warehouse in Tijuana. It involves infusions of chile, gargling mole, consuming peyote-infused chiclets, classes on how to sell oranges, the priests, architects and presidents, cops and convicts, sinners and saints. It involves baptisms in dirty sinks filled with salvation and Burritos, splashes of tapatio, baptizing your tongue para la lengua to spit fiery words, puto, puta, chingon, chingada madre. These words are whole and holy, spoken in backyards and barbecues, weddings and quinceañeras. Yo no hablo español. Un poquito. Make me more Mexican, indigenous and genuine. Hail on my head and smoke trails of sage. Take me to sit at the feet of the pyramids, so that these visions of me as sore-thumbed, pink-skinned, sunburnt Indian praying to the four winds won't seem so shallow and ridiculous. Yo, no, I dedicate this to the temple of football with an entrance shaped like a goal. Spanish and resistance. This is what makes a Mexican. And this is what doesn't. Stereotype and reality, truth and contradiction, sound and fury and quiet moments. This is what makes a Mexican. Like speaking Spanish, I will learn to make myself more Mexican. What do I want? To have an identity. What do I want? To be accepted. Cuando, ahora, donde, aquí, right here, and right now. Thank you very much, Scott and Jenny.
That was great.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
The goal it cut out the sound for about a second, but it was very
it was too real for
yeah.
sound. Zoom couldn't handle it.
Well,
but, oh yeah. And just one last thing to close out the episode. I did want to give the shout out to the homie in memoriam, Daniel Morales Leon, also known as Chapulín. Chapu Grasshopper was a poet from South Los Angeles who was a vital part of the Boyle Heights Greater East Side spoken word poetry rap community who sadly passed away this past weekend. So yes, for those of us, he organized events, he performed with us, partied with us, hung out. He will be dearly missed.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, my condolences. Well, with that, I think that wraps us up. I want to thank David Romero and you, Jenny, for being here. We'll see you guys next time.